Well, everyone, welcome again. And here we are for the last chapter of The Magician's Nephew. And what an exciting book it's been. And I think it's going to end in an exciting way too, don't you? The last words of chapter 14 were, "Please," he said, "may we go home now?" He had forgotten to say thank you, but he meant it, and Aslan understood. And of course, he's going to go home and take that apple that Aslan let him pick. That special apple. He's going to take it home to his mother. Let's talk about that in the next chapter. "You need no rings when I am with you," said the voice of Aslan. The children blinked and looked about them. They were once more in the wood between the worlds. Uncle Andrew lay on the grass, still asleep, and Aslan stood beside them. "Come," said Aslan. "It's time that you went back, but there are two things to see first. A warning and a command. Look here, children." They looked and saw in a little hollow in the grass there was an indentation with a grassy bottom, worn and warm and dry. "When you were last here," said Aslan, "that hollow was a pool, and when you jumped into it, you came to the world where a dying sun shone above the ruins of Charn. There is no pool now. The world has ended, as if it had never been. Let the race of Adam and Eve take warning." "Yes, Aslan," said both the children, but Polly added, "But we're not quite as bad as that world, are we, Aslan?" "Not yet, daughter of Eve, not yet, but you are growing more like it. It is not certain that some wicked one of your race will not find out a secret as evil as the deplorable word and use it to destroy all living things. And very soon, before you are an old man and an old woman, great nations in your world will be ruled by tyrants who care no more for joy and justice and mercy than the Empress Jadis. Let your world beware. That is the warning. And now for the command. As soon as you can, take from this Uncle Andrew of yours his magic rings and bury them so that no one can ever use them again." Both children were looking up into Aslan's face as he spoke these words, and all at once, they never knew exactly how it happened, the face seemed to be a sea of tossing gold in which they were floating, and such sweetness and power rolled about them over and over again and entered into them that they felt that they had never been happy or wise or good or even alive or awake before now. And the memory of that moment stayed with them always, so that as long as they both lived, if ever they were sad or angry or afraid, they just thought of all that golden goodness, and the feeling that was still there quite close, just around the corner or just behind some door, would come back and make them sure that deep down inside all was well. Next minute, all three of them, Uncle Andrew now awake, came tumbling into the noise, heat, and hot smells of London. They were on the pavement outside the Ketterleys' front door. And except that the witch, the horse, and the cabby were gone, everything was exactly as they had left it. There was the lamppost with its arm missing. There was the wreck of the hansom cab, and there was the crowd. Everyone was still talking, and people were kneeling beside the damaged policeman, saying things like, "He's coming right now. Oh, how you feel, old chap? The ambulance will be here in a jiffy." "Great Scott," thought Diggory. "I believe our adventure has taken no time at all." Most people were looking wildly around for Jadis and the horse. No one took any notice of the children, for no one had seen them go or noticed them coming back. And as for Uncle Andrew, what between the state of his clothes and the honey on his face, he couldn't have been recognized by anyone. Fortunately, the front door of the house was open, and the housemaid was standing in the doorway, staring at the fun. What a day that girl was having. So the children had no difficulty in bustling under Uncle Andrew indoors before anyone asked them any questions. He raced up the stairs before them, and at first they were very afraid that he was heading to his attic and meant to hide his remaining magic rings. But they needn't have bothered. What he was thinking about was that bottle in his wardrobe, and he disappeared at once into his bedroom and locked the door. When he came out again, which was not for a very long time, he was in his bathrobe and made straight for the bathroom. "Can you get the other rings, Paul?" said Diggory. "I want to go to Mother." "Right, see you later," said Polly, and she clattered up the attic stairs. Then Diggory took a moment or two to catch his breath and went softly into Mother's room. And there she lay, as he had seen her lie so many other times, propped up on the pillows, a thin, gray, pale face that made you want to cry to look at it. Diggory took the apple of life out of his pocket. And just as the witch Jadis had looked different when you saw her in our world instead of her own, so the fruit of that mountain garden looked different too. There were, of course, all sorts of colored things in the bedroom. The colored quilt on the bed, the wallpaper, the sunlight from the window, and Mother's pretty pale blue nightgown. But the moment Diggory took the apple out of his pocket, all those things seemed to have scarcely any color at all. Every one of them, even the sunlight, looked faded and dingy. The brightness of the apple threw strange lights on the ceiling. Nothing else was even worth looking at. You couldn't look at anything else. And the smell of the apple of youth was as if there was a window in that room that opened onto heaven. "Oh, darling, how lovely," said Diggory's mother. "You will eat it, won't you?" "Please," said Diggory. I don't know what the doctor would say, but I really do think I could." He peeled it and cut it up and gave it to her piece by piece. And no sooner had she finished it than she smiled and her head sank back on the pillow and she was asleep. A real, natural, gentle sleep without any of those nasty drugs, which was, as Diggory knew, the one thing in the whole world that she needed the most. And he was sure now that her face looked a little different. He bent down and kissed her very softly and stole out of the room with a beating heart, taking the core of the apple with him. For the rest of that day, whenever he looked at the things about him and saw how ordinary and unmagical they were, he hardly dared to hope. But then he remembered the face of Aslan, and he did hope. That evening, he buried the core of the apple in the back garden. The next morning, when the doctor made his usual visit, Diggory leaned over the banister to listen. He heard the doctor come out with Aunt Letty and say, "Miss Ketterley, this is the most extraordinary case I have ever known in my whole medical career. It's like a miracle. I wouldn't tell the little boy anything at present, but I wouldn't want to raise any false hopes. But in my opinion," then his voice became too low to hear. That afternoon he went down to the garden and whistled their agreed secret signal for Polly. She hadn't been able to get back the day before. "What luck?" said Polly, looking over the wall. "I mean, about your mother." I think it's going to be all right," said Diggory. "But if you don't mind, I'd really rather not talk about it yet." "What about the rings?" "I've got them all," said Polly. "Look, it's all right. I'm wearing gloves. Let's bury them." "Oh, yes, let's. I've marked the place where I buried the core of the apple yesterday." So Polly climbed over the wall, and they went together to the place. But as it turned out, Diggory need not have marked the place. Something was already coming up. It wasn't growing so that you could see it grow, as the new trees had done in Narnia, but it was already well above the ground. They got a trowel and buried all the magic rings, including their own, in a circle around it. After about a week, it was quite certain that Diggory's mother was getting better. About 2 weeks later, she was able to sit out in the garden. And a month later, the whole house had become a different place. Aunt Letty did everything that Mother liked. The windows were opened, frowsy curtains were drawn back to brighten up the rooms. There were fresh flowers everywhere, nicer things to eat. And the old piano was tuned, and Mother took up her singing again, and had such games with Diggory and Polly that Aunt Letty would say, "I declare, Mabel, you're the biggest child of the three." When things go wrong, you'll find they usually go on getting worse for some time. But when things start going right, they often go on getting better and better. After about 6 weeks of this lovely life, there came a long letter from the father in India, and it had wonderful news in it. Old great Uncle Kirk had died, and this meant apparently that father was now very rich. He was going to retire and come home from India forever and ever. And the great big house in the country, which Diggory had heard of all his life and had never seen, would now be their home. The big house with the suits of armor, the stables, the kennels, the river, the park, the greenhouses, the vineries, the woods, and the mountains behind it. So that Diggory felt, just as you would, that they were all going to live happily ever after. But perhaps you would like to know one or two things more. Polly and Diggory were always great friends, and she came nearly every holiday to stay with them at their beautiful house in the country. And that's where she learned to ride and swim and milk and bathe and climb. In Narnia, the beasts lived in great peace and joy, and neither the witch or any other enemy came to trouble that pleasant land for hundreds of years. King Frank and Queen Helen and their children lived happily in Narnia, and their second son became king of Archenland. The boys married nymphs, and the girls married wood gods and river gods. The lamppost, which the witch had planted without knowing it, shone night and day in the Narnia forest, so that the place where it grew came to be called Lantern Waste. And when, many years later, another child from our world got into Narnia on a snowy night, she found the light still burning. And that adventure was, in a way, connected with the ones I've just been telling you about. It was like this. The tree, which had sprang from the apple that Diggory planted in the back garden, lived and grew into a fine tree. Growing in the soil of our world, far out of the sound of Aslan's voice and far from the young air of Narnia, it did not bear apples that would revive a dying woman, as Diggory's mother had revived, though it did bear apples more beautiful than others in England, and they were extremely good for you, but not fully magical. But inside itself, in the very sap of the tree, it never forgot that other tree in Narnia to which it belonged. Sometimes it would move mysteriously when there was no wind blowing. I think that when this happened, there were high winds in Narnia, and the English tree quivered, because at that moment the Narnia tree was rocking and swaying as if in a strong southwestern gale. However that might be, it was proved later that there really was magic in its wood. For when Diggory was quite middle-aged, and he was a famous learned man, a professor and a great traveler by this time, and the Kennerley's old house belonged to him, there was a great storm all over the south of England, which blew the tree down. He couldn't bear to have it simply chopped up for firewood, so he had part of the timber made into a wardrobe, which he put in his big house in the country. Now, you might not know what a wardrobe is, because we don't really have them in our houses here. In England, in those days when they built houses, they didn't put closets in the bedrooms. So you had to buy a piece of furniture to keep your clothes in. And that piece of furniture was big and high enough that it had a rod in there where you could hang up your dresses or shirts or whatever, and drawers and whatever. So it served as sort of a dresser and a closet at the same time. Here's a picture of a Victorian wardrobe. Sorry, my printer seems to be running out of ink. But you can see in the center section, there's a bar there where you could hang up your clothes. And then on either side, shelves where you could pile up your socks and your shirts. And then down in the bottom, there were some drawers where you could keep other things that you wanted to keep, whatever they were. In Uncle Andrew's case, maybe he had his bottle of brandy down there. We're not sure. Anyway, that's a Victorian wardrobe right there. And that's what Diggory had made from the wood of that apple tree from Narnia. And though he himself did not discover the magic properties of that wardrobe, someone else did. That was the beginning of all the comings and goings between Narnia and our world, which you can read of in other books. And I'd like to read those to you if you'd be interested in listening to them. So we'll start with the next one next time, called The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. We'll find out, won't we? When Diggory and his people went to live in the big country house, they took Uncle Andrew to live with them. For Diggory's father said, "We must try to keep the old fellow out of mischief, and it isn't fair that poor Letty should always have him on her hands." Uncle Andrew never tried any mischief again, any magic again, as long as he lived. He had learned his lesson. And in his old age, he became a nicer and less selfish old man than he had ever been before. But he always liked to get visitors alone and tend the billiard room usually and tell them stories about a mysterious lady, foreign royalty, whom he had driven about in London. "A devilish temper he had," he would say. "A devilish temper she had," he would say. "But she was a jolly fine woman, sir, a jolly fine woman." And that is the end of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Wasn't that a wonderful story? I wonder if you have noticed as we've been telling this story that there are some pictures in this story, pictures in our mind that remind us of certain things in the Bible. Had you noticed that? If somebody asked you, what person in the Bible would Aslan remind you of? I wonder what you would say. I'd say the Lord Jesus. Does the Lord Jesus know everything? Yes, he does. Is the Lord Jesus full of love and compassion? Yes, he is. Does the Lord Jesus have all power? Yes, he does. Did the Lord Jesus speak and all the things in this world come into being? Yes, he did. Yes, he did. Is the Lord Jesus a lion? No, he's not, although one of his titles is Lion of the Tribe of Judah. So when C.S. Lewis was writing this book, he wanted you to look beyond just the story on the surface and to see some spiritual truth in there too. But he's not only talking about Jesus, is he? Who does Jadis remind you of? Is she a lady who has any love or compassion? No, she doesn't. Does she have a lot of power? Yes, she does. Does she have as much power as Aslan? No, she doesn't. Does she do anything good at all in this whole story? No, she doesn't. Who does she remind you of? She reminds us of Satan, doesn't she? And when Diggory was being tempted in that garden, doesn't that remind you of how Satan in the Garden of Eden tried to tempt Eve to make her eat the forbidden fruit? And we know, regrettably, that Eve did eat the forbidden fruit and sin came into our world. So this story that we've just read has lots of pictures in it of things that remind us of the battle between Satan and Jesus, and who do you think is going to win? Well, when we read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, I hope you'll keep your eyes and your ears open. And at the end, we'll talk about some things about Jesus and Satan that he mentions in that book. So I'll see you next time when we get together and we start reading The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Thank you for being with me. I've really enjoyed being with you. Bye.